We have our first Azuite Sea tournament at Southside Gaming in America with a quadruple case tournament. Some big names in this one, in particular Brennan DeCandio, who's a very well-known player within the community. And we're going to look at the best 8 performing decks. A case is 4 boxes, so this was a 16 booster box tournament, so really, really nice prizing. Want to, of course, give a shout out to the channel sponsor, which is Card Market. Great place to buy your singles online in Europe, and really interesting to see some of the best sellers here from Azuite Sea so far. We're going to start off with a 8th place list, which is by Kamal Crooks in Emerald Steel. And obviously a lot of these decks are going to be quite similar to things we've seen in previous sets. It's a brand new set. People might not have access to all the new cards. This was a tournament which happened on Saturday, and the cards were released at local game stores on the Friday. So there's going to be players who don't necessarily have all the cards that they want to play, and there's also going to be people that maybe just want to play it a little bit more safe. For a big tournament like this, they don't want to experiment that much. And I think as the set goes on over the next week or two, we're going to start seeing some more unique lists. But there is definitely some very exciting decks in this one, including the deck which won it being a bit of an unorthodox color combo. Certainly something we didn't see much in the previous set. So what have we got that's new in this deck? Well, Honey Lemon stands out like a sore thumb. Only 2 copies of her. When you play this character, you may pay 2 ink to have each opponent choose and discard a card. It's a card I've been very, very high up on in the pre-release talks. It's just an extra card that you can play in a discard deck, which says discard, and it's also a decent card to play. Once you've already discarded your opponent's hand, you just play 2, pay 2 ink, and it can quest for 2. So it's a very, very strong card. I would anticipate that Honey Lemon might prove to be a card which players play 4 copies of once the most meta versions of Emerald Steel settle. The other new card which catches the eye is Calhoun, which is, Calhoun, I think I got told it's pronounced, which is a really, really fascinating new rare card in Steel. It is uninkable, but it has resist 1, and during your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, gain 2 lore. We know how powerful Robin Hood can be, the legendary, which has a very similar ability. So to have this ability on a 2-cost uninkable, which can start challenging on turn 3 with resist, is quite incredible. Very, very strong card. Of course, does come with the downside of being uninkable. However, Hypnotic Deduction, kind of the unorthodox inclusion in this deck, not something you see in the most refined meta versions of the deck. Draw 3 cards, put 2 in your hand, and draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on the top of your deck in any order. Not a card I'm a big fan of in this deck, and not one I would recommend playing, but there's certainly worse cards to include. So big shout out to Kamal. I've also got Blue Steel, or Sapphire Steel as it's actually called. First time I'm seeing this list. Now, I think Sapphire Steel was secretly one of the best decks in the previous metagame in set 5. A lot of the guys I was testing in Seattle with were playing Sapphire Steel, so it's a deck I've got a lot of experience playing against towards the end of set 5. What did it get that's new? Well, it got quite a lot that's new. I think in particular, Sail the Azuite Sea is a really interesting new Sapphire card. It was one of the best sellers there on Card Market. This turn you may put an additional card from your hand into your Inkwell face down, draw a card. So working in a very similar way to Tipo or One Jump Ahead, and filling that same kind of slot. Some other new cards which catch the eye here. There's 1 copy of Wreck-It Ralph Ham Hands, which was a card that I revealed. When this character quests, you may banish chosen item or location to gain 2 lore. So of course you can target your own things like Fortosphere and Porpsicles, ready for your Tamatoa down the line. But while that's quite good because your Wreck-It Ralph is essentially questing for 5, it becomes even more extraordinary if your opponent has items or locations, because you can deal with them. Traditionally, Sapphire Steel struggled quite a lot against Queen's Castle, and therefore when playing against Ruby Amethyst, a lot of the time Ruby Amethyst players will just play Queen's Castle as soon as possible. Well, if you can get that Wreck-It Ralph down nice and early with Ramping and Fishbone Quill, I think Wreck-It Ralph could be absolutely extraordinary. I'm actually surprised that people are not quite as excited about Wreck-It Ralph as I am. I think it could be a really, really powerful card. Not one that you're likely to play 4 copies of, with it being uninkable. And as we continue to have more sets in Disney Lorcana, it's more difficult to justify slotting in uninkable cards, because there's of course so many other uninkable cards which are already very, very strong. But I can absolutely see Wreck-It Ralph being a card which finds its way into Sapphire Steel decks as a staple, And I think 2 copies of Wreck-It Ralph is probably what I'd lean towards. I could see a world that you play 3, and I think it's very hard to argue with just playing a single copy. So really nice to see Wreck-It Ralph in the mix here, because I think a lot of people would have ignored it. It's also a new Jim Hawkins card, actually a couple of new Jim Hawkins cards. We'll start off with the 2-cost one, kind of comparable to Prince Eric from the first chapter. During your turn, whenever a card is put into your inkwell, this character gains Challenger 2 this turn. I think this card's quite interesting, but I think there's a lot of very strong competition for steel cards in this slot. You've got Mr. Smee and also Calhoun as a new card, which we were just looking at. So I'm not convinced that Jim Hawkins is going to find its way into the most refined versions of these decks. But if ever it was good a deck, I think Sapphire Steel would be the one. Of course, you're able to put multiple cards into your inkwell at once, so you can turn this into a 4/4 quite easily. And what Dominic's gone for here is this new Floodborn Jim Hawkins. So this 2-cost becomes more valuable because it's a shift target. It's shift 3. Whenever you play this character, you may deal 1 damage to chosen character or location. This card's in the starter decks, I believe, and it performed quite well for me. I think it's a card which is going to be quite good in sealed and draft, but I think with it being uninkable, despite having a very solid stat line, I just think that there's better options in Sapphire Steel with so many. Like I say, it's so difficult now for uninkable cards to actually fit into these lists, because you have a finite amount of uninkables that you can play. Sapphire Steel can play more than most, but even then you've got things like Hades, Grab Your Swords, Lucky Dimes, Fire the Cannons, which are quite difficult to not include. Cheacher also being a very popular card at the moment in Sapphire Steel. So it's really difficult to fit these kinds of uninkable cards into your deck consistently. So I don't imagine either of these Jim Hawkins cards are going to be in the most refined versions of the list moving forwards, but nice to see them nonetheless. I think, there's 2 more new cards actually. There's Pleakley, and Sapphire's got quite a lot of new interesting characters around the 2 and 3 cost mark. Usually when we see Sapphire, you're going to be seeing it in this starter deck where you're ramping up, and therefore you're more likely to see big cards like Tamatoa, and a lot of these kind of 3 cost cards tend to fall out of the meta a little bit, but I do think there might be enough Sapphire cards now to have a kind of more aggressive build. And Pleakley's a really interesting card for that, with a 3/4 stat line being an inkable card. That's really, really solid. When you play this character, put a chosen character of yours into inkwell face down and exerted. Important to note, that's not a may. You have to do it, which is definitely a big downside of Pleakley. And I'm not convinced that I think Pleakley belongs in this particular deck, if I'm honest. But one combo that could be really interesting to look out for is playing Tipo on turn 2 and then Pleakley on turn 3, putting your Tipo into your inkwell. You could quest with it for 1. Often Tipo is going to be removed very easily. You could even sing, for example, 1 jump ahead with the Tipo and then use Pleakley on it to get a whole bunch of ramp very, very quickly. So I think Pleakley's a really interesting card. And Pluto is the other one, which is a 1/5 bodyguard. When this character has no damage, it gets +4. So a 5/5 bodyguard as an option. Really, really interesting card. Again, not convinced personally that I would be playing it in Sapphire Steel. I think there's some really interesting ideas. Funny enough, in a Sapphire Steel deck built in a bit of a different way with a lower curve. There's a new Alice card, which is in Sapphire, 3-cost uninkable. I think it's a 1/4, which quests for 2. It has Ward. And when you quest with Alice, you can give a character of your choice +1 lore and Ward. So being able to give that Pluto Ward and turn it into a 5/5 bodyguard is something that I know a lot of people have been talking about as a potential combo. So that's something to look out for. Overall, the list from Dominic is pretty nice, with a few new set 6 cards sprinkled in, which I'm not convinced will be making the cut moving forward. But I think Sail the Azurite Sea, Wreck-It Ralph are 2 cards I can absolutely see making the cut. And I think the rest of the way that this Sapphire Steel deck has been built is most likely what you're going to continue to see in a quite similar fashion. Mr. Smee, I think, is going to replace Jim Hawkins. It will be interesting to see if Calhoun can make the cut, with Cheacher being such a powerful option. But I think the rest of it looks really, really solid. It's also going to be an interesting thing to see how Sail the Azurite Sea and Tipo kind of compete for a slot and 1 jump ahead. Obviously, all very, very similar cards. The gut feeling for most players would be that Sail the Azurite Sea is going to be the card that goes in there, but it might not be quite as simple as we see, and it's going to be really interesting to see how that all settles moving forward. On to another top 8 deck. First time I'm seeing a lot of these. We've got Raymond Riviera with Ruby and Amethyst. And there is 1 new card in this one, but what a card it is. Contender for best card of the set. And it's Genie Wish fulfilled. It's an evasive, it quests for 2, and when you play this character, draw a card. A lot of people are thinking this might replace Rabbit, or it certainly compete with the Rabbit, but Raymond here going for both the Rabbit and the Genie. And I think in a Ruby Amethyst deck, that does make quite a bit of sense to try and play both. One thing I don't like about this deck is the lack of locations. I think Queen's Castle in particular is most likely still a card which I expect Ruby Amethyst players to be playing, and it's probably the Queen's Castle which has been sacrificed for the Genie. Not easy to fit everything, of course it's not, but I would imagine that maybe Queen's Castle could find its way into it. I do like to see Lady Tremaine, couple copies of that. Only 2 Medusas though, maybe seems a little bit risky to me. But nice list nonetheless. I think Diablo also going to be an interesting card, the new Amethyst Diablo, to see if that could creep into these Ruby Amethyst decks as well. When I'm looking at these Amethyst decks, I personally would really like to play Chernobog's Brooms and the Diablo. Diablo could be quite nice with the Crab in particular, but going to be interesting to see how Ruby Amethyst goes. We saw some really unique Ruby Amethyst decks do quite well in Seattle, which were playing a burn game plan. Burn game plan kind of meaning you have things like Super Goof and Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom and Goats. Of course, you've got the White Rose as well now, which is a 3-cost Amethyst card, which when you play it, you gain 1 lore. Also in Ruby, you have things like a Pirate's Life, which gains you 2 lore, as well as a new card, Thievery, which gains 1 lore and steals 1 lore from opponent. So there's definitely some very interesting ways you can go about building Ruby Amethyst. This is, of course, the classic setup, but I think there's room for more experimentation with this color combination. Up next, we've got the main man. We've got Brennan DeCandio, who I believe was 1st or 2nd seed, I think possibly 1st seed, going into the top cut after Swiss. And Brennan DeCandio, very, very well known for these Amber Steel decks historically. We saw in the last set the Lantern builds of Steel and Amber getting very, very popular, and it was Brennan DeCandio that popularized that. So always interesting to see what approach he's gone for. Let's first and foremost look at the new set 6 cards. There's the Calhoun card we've been talking about a lot. No Mr. Oh, there is Mr. Smee as well. So I like that from Brennan to include both Calhoun and Smee. Also, 4 copies of Lilo Escape Artist, which quests for 2, and at the start of your turn, if this card is in your discard, you may play her and she enters play exerted. So what's interesting about Lilo is she's actually a better card if you're able to discard her from your hand, which Steel is the most likely pairing for that. For example, if you were to play Doc, you can discard your hand to draw 2 cards. Well, if Lilo's one of the cards that you would discard, usually you're not happy about discarding a card. But with Lilo, you might be able to play her from your discard pile down the line. There's also a Whole New World. There's also cards like Simba and Cinderella, which when you play them, draw a card and discard a card. Not huge synergy in this one, though, with the Lilo. It is just the Doc, which can put her into the discard, I believe. No Whole New World in this one, which is of course quite interesting. Then the other new set 6 card is the Pluto Guard Dog as well, the 5/5 bodyguard when it enters play with that good boy ability. Very, very interesting card, similar to Lawrence. Obviously, if things like Tinkerbell and Grab Your Swords become part of the meta, then cards like Lawrence and Pluto become worse. But these cards are going to be incredibly difficult for things like Ruby to deal with. Lawrence, of course, we know is good against Medusa. And Pluto, if Maui comes through and wants to deal with that Pluto, the Maui is going to be traded out itself as well, unless some other damage is sunk in there. Now, the rest of the deck is really, really fascinating, using the 7 Dwarfs Mine, which was actually a card I have tested a lot of in set 5. I was very, very close to playing 7 Dwarfs Mine in my list for Seattle, but I actually cut it, I think, a day or 2 before the tournament. But it is a card I like quite a lot with Doc. Doc is a knight. Basically, 7 Dwarfs Mine gains you 1 lore passively each turn, and it costs 2 to move a card there. And if you move a card there, the first time you do that each turn, you deal 1 damage. And if you move a knight in there, you deal 2 damage. So Doc and Happy are both knights. Of course, Happy being evasive during your own turn is a potential answer to Diablo as well. But rather than going for the traditional aerial Whole New World setup, it's still using Cinderella with Let the Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire, but then just filling it out with cards which can quest for quite a lot. So really fascinating list by Brennan DeCandio. I think Doc is just an amazing card and it allows you to build your decks in some different ways. I'm actually working on a Amber Steel deck myself at the moment. kind of has some similar ideas, and I might take a bit of inspiration from this list. But yeah, really, really cool list from Brennan DeCandio for sure. I think there's definitely potential for Amber Steel decks to play without Aerial and a whole new world, without doubt. The more cards we get, the more competitive lists like this are likely to become. Up next, into the top 4, we have Bird Gang by Colby Garish, which is, of course, Diablo. Diablo has not gone anywhere, and there is only one set 6 card in this, 2 copies of it, and that is Go to Margot. When you play this character, you may pay 2 ink to gain lore equal to the damage on chosen opposing character. So if your opponent has a Maui with 4 damage counters on it, you can pay 4 ink total for Go to Margot. You get a 2/2 evasive, which quests for 1, and you gain 4 lore as soon as you play it. So very, very powerful card potentially. Obviously, it can combine particularly well with Steel, with Let the Storm Rage On, Strength of a Raging Fire, Tinkerbell, Baboom, all those sorts of things, and everything else is exactly what we're used to seeing. 3 copies of the Hidden Cove. Personally, I'm not going to go into it in too much detail at this moment, but we'll certainly talk about it in the future. I am personally in the camp of banning Diablo. I actually think it's a very oppressive card. I got Diablo wrong when it was revealed. I said it's the most overrated card in history. Well, I was wrong. It's very OP. The problem that I have with Diablo, and again, I don't want to talk about it too much, is how it just sets up this imbalance in the game so early on. For example, when I played in Seattle, I played a deck which had 4 copies of Fire the Cannons and 2 copies of Baboom. You'd think I should be pretty good against Diablo. Well, no. I got 2-0'd by it, and I drew with it a couple of times. So I think that just shows you how strong Diablo is. And okay, you might say, well, Specie, you're just not very good. Maybe that's fair. I think the biggest issue with Diablo actually is the Hidden Cove synergy, and that's why we're seeing a lot of players up the Hidden Cove count to 3, sometimes even 4. Being able to have a Diablo with 3 strength and 3 willpower on turn 2 that can also sing things like Storm Rage On and Strength of a Raging Fire to control the board is absolutely unequivocally unfair, and I think it needs to go. I really, really do. I think a fix for it could be Hidden Cove getting errated, where it maybe costs a bit more to move Hidden Cove in there, but that would just kind of be a band-aid fix. I think Diablo is the issue. I think Bucky kind of died for Diablo's sins as well. Don't get me wrong, I think Bucky, in a year's time, 2 years' time, I could see it being a problematic card potentially that limits design space, but for me, Diablo is a real menace, and I think the game would be more enjoyable without it. And I think you guys have to make sure that when you're building your decks, you are prepared for Diablo, because I think this Emerald Steel deck is not going anywhere. And I think, unfortunately, it is going to be very, very similar list to what we saw in Set 5. And it's not a deck I enjoy at all. But anyway, that's my little Diablo rant. Moving on to some more exciting lists. We have a Ruby and Amber aggro deck by Monty Thompson in the top 3. And this is such an exciting list. Funnily enough, I have right in front of me a similar deck that's also using Just in Time in Ruby. And I'm actually going to be streaming it later on. Mine is focusing on locations with the new Sugar Rush Speedway and Jim Hawkins. My deck plays Just in Time into Jim Hawkins. But Just in Time, a card I loved in Set 1. It was my favorite Set 1 card in a lot of ways. And it continues to get better with this Simba Pride Protector card being a 5-cost Amber card. That's a big deal, right? Like, Just in Time is obviously an Amber card. And historically, I think the 5-cost Amber cards have kind of been balanced a little bit around that. You haven't really had too many incredible 5-cost Amber cards. But Simba is definitely one that gives you some potential. Of course, other targets for Just in Time is going to be the Maui, the Kida. But even just being able to Just in Time into Rapunzel on turn 3... after you've played that Mother Gothel on turn 2 is definitely no joke. Just in Time into Vanellope von Schweetz as well, which can rush in with evasive and deal with a Diablo. So Just in Time, very, very nice card in this one for sure. I think it is better in the Jim Hawkins deck. 4 copies of Just in Time can definitely get you in to a lot of trouble. But the 1-cost cards is going to be Kida, Daisy, and Lilo. No room for the Moana in this list. There's also the Lilo Escape Artist, which doesn't have an abundance of synergy in this deck, but is definitely synergizing nicely with Simba, because at the end of your turn, Simba is going to ready your other characters if Simba is exerted. So you're going to pay 2 for Lilo to play her from the discard. She's going to come in exerted. You quest if you're Simba, and then you can ready your Lilo and your other characters. So there's definitely some nice synergy there. And then just some big questers like Piglet. Also, these 2-cost Simbas, the Bodyguard and the Scrappy Cub as really interesting shift targets. The 2-cost Ruby Simba is a really, really nice shift target, actually. Someone in my YouTube comments mentioned this bit of synergy, so shout out to them. You can quest for 3 with the Simba, then shift in the Simba Pride Protector, which is pretty cool. You get like an extra little bit of lore. The Sisu Goofy, so it's a pretty aggro build, brawl in there as well. Very, very interesting to see how Ruby Amber develops. I think the location build is more likely going to be the way that the meta lists settle. I think the Sugar Rush Speedway is an absolutely absurdly strong card. Again, I'm actually going to be playing that on my stream later on today, so make sure you subscribe for a deck guide on that. But big shout out to Monty Thompson, bringing back Amber Ruby, Rapunzel, still that money card draw, but there's a lot of cool things going on. With Daisy Duck, Flynn Rider, not in this list with Sisu. You can definitely get very, very aggressive with Jim Hawkins as well, just in time. All sorts of cool things going on. Definitely a color combo I'm excited to explore. In second place, we have Ruby Sapphire, saving the best till last, of course. And the top winning deck is one I'm most excited about. Ruby Sapphire, let's see what's new in this one. A couple copies of Maui Half Shark. I'm not convinced that Maui Half Shark will necessarily find its way into Ruby Sapphire decks. I think Maui Half Shark is maybe a card you build your whole entire deck around and might enable some more unique, unorthodox color combos. I think Ruby Emerald is obviously one which is going to come to mind for me, which you guys are not going to be surprised to hear after all my Ruby Emerald action decks in the past. But also, I think you could build like a Ruby Amethyst deck with Maui Half Shark as your kind of centerpiece card. Whereas here, it just feels like it's just kind of slotted in. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not a bad card by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not necessarily sure it will find its way into these lists because I think they're very, very tight. But nice to see it nonetheless. And I think if you are going to play it in this kind of deck, 2 copies seems like a nice amount. Obviously, you can gain 1 lore whenever you play an action. But moreover, whenever this character challenges another character, you may return an action card from your discard to your hand. And there are a lot of good options. Let It Go, Be Prepared, Hide Away, How Far I Go, Brawl, Vision of the Future, and Sail the Azurite Sea are all very, very powerful within their own right. I just don't anticipate it to actually make the cut, if I'm honest, in this deck. Sail the Azurite Sea also makes it. Now, the big deal about Sail the Azurite Sea compared with One Jump Ahead, which is what it's replacing in the list here by Hector, is, okay, you can't sing One Jump Ahead with Tipo, which slows you down earlier on, but that also means that your One Jump Ahead can't be discarded by Ursula Deceiver, which is something that happens all the time when you're going second with this deck, that Ursula Deceiver comes through and discards your one jump before you're able to play it. But I think the biggest difference is in the late game. If you're in top deck mode and you draw into a one jump ahead, you feel like you lose the game. Whereas if you draw into Sail the Azurite Sea, okay, it's not great, but you can just pay 2 to draw a card. And then you might draw something better. So it's much, much better in the late game and arguably slightly worse in the early game unless you're playing against Emerald. And obviously Emerald is one of the most common decks that we saw in the previous meta, particularly Emerald Steel and Ruby Sapphire were arguably the 2 most popular decks in the metagame last set. So the fact that Sail the Azurite Sea gives you better coverage against Emerald and also gives you better late game, I think it will end up making the cut in these decks. So yeah, not too much else to talk about in this one. It's stuff we've seen a lot in previous sets. But the top winning deck is the color combo that I am also going to be playing myself to start off this set. Deck guide coming soon. I've got a $100 version of this deck. This one's definitely a little bit more pricey, but amazing to see Dylan Crowley winning it with my favorite color combination at the moment, which is Amethyst Steel. It's actually the color combination I played in Seattle, and it's one that got so much better. This deck is built very, very differently to how I built my list. It's definitely a lot slower than my version, but has a stronger late game. So China Box followers and Robin Hood as the 1-cost options. There is also the Robin Hood Champion of Sherwood. 3 Fire the Cannons, no copies of Befuddle in this one. Obviously Fire the Cannon's going to be good against the Diablos. Blue Fairies in at 2, which is whenever you play a Floodborn character, you may draw a card. And there are an abundance of Floodborns. We've got Beast Tragic Hero, Belle, Accomplished Mystic, 4 copies of the Champion of Sherwood, which you'd expect when the Robin Hood Beloved Outlaw is in there. 3 copies of Tinkerbell, which, by the way, can shift onto the new Tinkerbell Fast Flyer, which is absolutely absurdly strong. Really, really excited for that combination when you're pairing Amethyst with Steel. Now, I played in set 4, many of you will remember, the Tiny Tink Tactician as a shift target to deal with the Bucky meta that we were in. So having this Tink Fast Flyer card, which is very good within its own right, an evasive which quests for 2, same stat line as Surfer Mini, in just in a color Amethyst, which much more fits the theme of this kind of card. Like, you don't tend to want to play Mini and Ruby decks anymore, but in a lot of Amethyst decks, Tinkerbell Fast Fire will make the cut. So the fact that it can sing friends and be a Tinkerbell shift target makes it absurdly strong. When you're shifting Tink, a lot of the value just comes in through your opponent being scared that you're going to shift Tink, and then that you don't even have to shift, right? Like, so this tiny Tink, this Tink Fast Flyer, when it hits the board, is almost representing... It is representing the threat of the Giant Fairy. And when Giant Fairy's on the board, you get these weird board states a lot of the time where your opponent is not going to quest. So the fact that this 3-cost evasive in this color combination can stop your opponent questing with their cards and you don't even need to shift the Giant Tink onto it is pretty extraordinary. Really, really powerful. Speaking of really powerful, we've got Genie Wish Fulfilled, card we've already talked about. Replacing the rabbit for the most part in this list. 1 copy of the rabbit in there as well. New Tinkerbell Queen of the Azurite Fairies. Not going to lie, I had to put her in the thumbnail because I'm not sure I'm going to get many more opportunities to do that because I don't think this card is very good at all. Whenever this character quests, your other fairy characters get +1 lore this turn. Other fairies though, Blue Fairy, okay, maybe I'm being a little bit harsh. The fact that Blue Fairy can quest for 2 is definitely not a joke. Obviously the Tinkerbell Fast Flyer is a fairy as well as the Giant Tink. So there are some, but realistically I'm not sure that's enough for a 7-cost Inkable. It is evasive, it has good stats, so it's definitely an interesting card. Of course, you can shift it onto the smaller Tink, but you don't want to shift it onto the smaller Tink particularly because you're shifting onto a card which quests for 2 to just play a card which quests for 2. Like, it's not really that impressive, I think. So I don't think the Tinkerbell Queen of the Azurite Fairies is actually that good. And I think, personally, I'm obviously biased, but the version that I've built for Amethyst Steel, which you guys are going to be seeing a lot more of very, very soon on the channel, I think is probably going to prove to be a little bit stronger. But I'm very biased because Amethyst Steel is the only deck I've played so far this set, and it's a deck which I played hundreds and hundreds of games of towards the end of set 5, because it's a deck I played in Seattle, and I have very strong opinions. My version plays 4 Diablos, 4 Chernobyls, 4 Magic Brooms, 4 Maleficents, 4 Fire the Cannons, a few Befuddles. It's much, much lower to the floor, my version. So this is definitely a very different version of the deck. And in fact, if I was to play against this deck with my version, I would lose almost every time. Like that Giant Tink, the Grab Your Swords would absolutely clean me up. So this is going to be good the longer the game goes on. But personally, I think that this deck is going to probably... I mean, I was going to say it's going to struggle against Ruby Sapphire, but it looks like it managed to beat Ruby Sapphire in the final, which is really, really fascinating. Yeah, really. Aladdin's in there as well. Oh, okay, because it's a Floodborn. Aladdin being a Floodborn for the Blue Fairy makes sense. I'm not convinced Blue Fairy builds are going to be the way to go, though. I think a lot of evasive answers are going to be in there, with Diablo still being very, very popular. As much as I love this list, I'm obviously biased and prefer mine. But really awesome to see this deck winning. Big, big shout out to everyone playing here. Big shout out to Dylan for taking it down. And big shout out to Southside Gaming, who organised this one, and also Inkdex for getting it up on their website. Also, thanks again to Card Market, who sponsor the channel. I really do appreciate all of their support. Don't forget to check them out if you're looking to buy singles in Europe. And thanks very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like, and let me know what deck you're most excited for Azurite Sea. Cheers.